Hey folks, welcome to Office Hours. So glad to be able to connect with you again, to be able to share this time together, and to welcome Jamie Sabbach, who is the founder and president and principal of 110%. She founded this organization back in 2010 to help Parks and Rec organizations be more responsible and bold as communities began to change or continue to change, and to be able to work together with a team, helping them to work with Parks and Rec departments. She's previously worked in Champaign, Illinois, in Bloomington, Indiana, in Boulder, Colorado, in Parks and Rec departments. She teaches as adjunct faculty member at numerous institutions in Illinois and other places, and now works as a consultant and an advisor, a coach, and someone that just helps places to do the hard work of providing for all of the existing needs and really upholding the values that really underscore so much of what Strong Towns is about, maintaining what we have, prioritizing the establishment of strong places, and especially focusing in on the needs of folks as they are currently, not just the ambition that we might have to one day be on the map or one day be, a mecca for one particular type of tourism or one type of attraction, but instead saying, how do we build prosperous places? Or she said, how do we design and develop emerging park and rec organizations that endure volatility and uncertainty? Or to use the language of Nassim Taleb, how do we ensure that even our parks and rec departments are anti-fragile? That is, that they get stronger as they are put under strain rather than beginning to fail. And so, Jamie, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself? I'd love to hear a little bit about how Strong Towns came onto your radar and how that feels like in many ways complemented much of the work that you've already been doing as a leader in this area, and just share a little bit about who you are and what's brought you to this point.
Sure. Well, Norm, thanks again for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to spend a bit of time with all of you today. I saw a note in the chat box. I think it was Jeffrey said he'd been in Boulder. Donna obviously is in Bloomington, Illinois, where I spent some time as a faculty member with Illinois State. So again, feel very privileged to be part of this conversation. I'll do my best to, I always find these things to sound a bit like eulogies while we're alive, but I've grew up in the Chicago metro area, still have family there that will always be home. I currently live in Salida, Colorado, which is 3 hours outside of Denver. I live in the mountains. I live on the Arkansas River, which is the most commercially rafted river in the U.S. I look at 14,000-foot peaks. So Parks and Recreation is a big part of who I am at my core. I started as a softball coach with the University of Illinois. I found Parks and Recreation as a discovery profession. Cut my teeth in the field in Champaign, Illinois, at the Champaign Park District as a sports program coordinator, and things just kind of grew from there. I moved to Bloomington, Indiana, where I started teaching at IU, Indiana University, and I became the director of recreation and community services. And then ended up at Illinois State for 2 years, teaching in public administration and park and recreation administration. And I became a student of quality of life services actually as a faculty member, not as a practitioner. Really began to understand our history and the context, and really our evolution of, being birthed on the backs of public spaces like Boston Commons, where we self-directed activity, and it was a space that we all owned and loved, and we could gravitate to it and do what we'd like. We wanted to believe it was accessible to all, but we recognized it really wasn't. To a place and time where parks and recreation and quality of life services have now become something for everyone all the time. And there's this expectation that simply by virtue of people paying taxes, it entitles them to everything they want and more. And that has become a collision course that's been damning, to say the least. I worked for the city of Boulder for 5 years after a pretty heated argument with a city council member who was quite entitled and expected that subsidies would continue to be directed to him and his friends. I went home that night after a 6-hour council meeting, had a shot of bourbon, and the next day I submitted my resignation and started the company. And the company was really designed, 110% was designed around being very bold and courageous and having the conversations that many just did not want to have. How are we using our resources? How we are investing our resources? How are we spending our resources? Are we creating sustainable systems or systems that ultimately are just going to simply die and fall off the map? And so the last 15 years, I've had the privilege of working alongside agencies across the U.S. We've worked in 43 of the 50 U.S. states. We've done some work in Canada. I've done some presentations over in Europe. And we now find ourselves being a bit of a differentiator in our space. Probably 80% of our portfolio is in financial sustainability work in local government. The other 20% will do a little bit of master and comp planning, but we're very discerning in which projects we'll work on. If it's simply a project in unicorns and rainbows, it's probably not for us, and we're certainly not the team for that organization. So that's a little bit of a backstory, rather brief. And Strong Towns, Chuck Marone actually came to Salida, Colorado, to Chaffee County, Colorado, and did a presentation. My wife happens to work for public health here, and she was quite enamored with him, said you'd really like his messages. I started to pay a little bit more attention. And then a big supporter of Strong Towns is Verdunity and Kevin Shepard. And Kevin and I are now partners. We work on projects together. And I actually just spent 3 days with him in College Station, Texas, talking about financial sustainability.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of connective tissue between the work that Strong Towns does in a very broad stroke way with what we do in a concentrated way for public park and rec systems. And public park and recreation, frankly, is the most complex budget in local government. I want you to imagine for a moment, these are systems that are providing childcare services and they're offering golf courses and
Yeah.
then everything in between. And so you've got kind of a social enterprise at work, along with very kind of broad health and wellness or social services provided for families, warming centers in the middle of climate threat, Meals on
Yeah.
Wheels programs. And then again, the expectation that you're going to manage and operate an 18-hole golf course and run it as an enterprise. So a
Yeah.
little bit about me, my introduction to Strong Towns.
Well, and even I mean, even with the recent Supreme Court decision providing also in many places housing for the unhoused or housing spaces at least for the unhoused, and many of those complex needs, and often the effort to tamp down admission fees or tamp down sort of user fees. And yet, if you look at the private analogs, their rates are, in a sense, what we could say would be market. And yet that's very, significantly higher, which raises the question, how is this then being financially sustainable? And so can you talk about that a little bit more? Because we do try to lean into the language of financial sustainability as something of a hack word that allows people to they come in with like, oh, financial responsibility or like financial obligations. And then you've got sustainability, which feels like it's unmoored from those things. You're really insistent that they're together, particularly in something that sometimes can feel softer. Oh, we're doing a good thing for everyone. Who doesn't want a good thing? How do you sort of navigate that? And what advice do you have for people that are trying to do the same in their community?
Yeah, that's such a great question and quite loaded. Um,
Yeah.
from my perspective, and obviously one person's perspective, we talked a lot about cost recovery in this world. And what we found was people were conflating it with you're just pricing people out of the market. You don't care. We shouldn't care about the bottom line. It should only about service to community. And working in a very heart-driven profession, the heart brain, that became quite a dangerous proposition to suggest that people were going to embrace the idea of cost recovery. I mean, even constituents, community members, residents, council members are like, oh, we shouldn't focus on the bottom line. We're only about revenue generation. And that was absolutely not the case.
Yeah.
Cost recovery is simply understanding your expenses and then determining philosophically what you should be recovering or
Yeah.
what you can recover. So we flipped the script. And sustainability, of course, you think about the Canadian models around environmental sustaining and social sustainability and economic sustainability. It's really very environmentally charged and focused, but it started to, I think, soften this idea that it was all about the bottom line. It was about, how do we plan for the residents and the citizens of 2050? How do we ensure you can pay the bills? Do you know how to do the math? Right. So we've kind of
Yeah.
just framed it a little bit differently, and starting to get people to think that constructing a pool is one thing, but you got to be able to operate it, maintain it into
Yeah.
perpetuity, right, over its
Yeah.
lifespan. And so it's just a different frame from which we still talk about the same things. We just do it under the umbrella of the idea of a sustainable system. Can you sustain what you've created? I will say often to professionals, council persons, are you going to be able to write the checks?
Yeah.
Right. At the end of the day, you got to be able to write the checks. And so
Yeah.
you want your name on a brass plaque in the lobby. That's great. You want to put a hard hat on and hold a golden shovel and dig holes and cut ribbons with big scissors. Good on you. But do you understand the consequences of your actions? And that's what we try to drive home. And I think couching it under the idea of financial sustainability just allows us, I think, to um, have people embrace that way of thinking a little bit more than just simply
Yeah.
it's all about cost recovery. So
100%. I love that. And I sometimes wonder if we could figure out a way with OSHA rules or safe workplace settings for contractors to have a half day like counselor work session where they just show up and they actually do some of the work of maintenance. They actually do some of the work of, maybe replacing the drop ceiling and let the local press know, take the pictures. Then that would be far like more dramatic of a scene of actually pitching in. And obviously, there are reasons why they want to be able to say, hey, something new is coming, but actually, isn't there so much value in repairing and maintaining the things that we already have? Which leads to a question that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. When we talk about safe and productive streets, one of the things that we're campaigning for is, for our streets to be really viewed as platforms for building wealth. And sometimes people will see like the urban three analysis of the relative financial performance of, say, your downtowns and other spaces. And the question emerges, how is a park productive? How is a park prosperity building? And if so, if you say it has no value and or in fact it's a net drain on our community, doesn't that mean that you're just going to, put businesses in and knock it down? So I guess, and we obviously have a lot of ways that we respond to that by talking about how it radiates wealth into the broader community and serves as a benefit to everyone. I love the idea of like quality of life services. But in what way is a park productive, and how does it build prosperity, and how do you help people to see that value in maybe some of the residual amenities in the community already, so that they don't immediately say, well, we need more. In fact, they might already have what they need at hand. So I know I'm throwing like 8 different things at you. Just
No,
react.
yeah, and forgive me if I don't address all of the
Yeah.
points that you made. It makes me think. I just had coffee this morning with a colleague, a partner organization, Civic Brand, Ryan Short, brilliant
Hmm.
gentleman. It's a lot on equitable engagement and an alternative way to think about kind of the conventional, traditional way to reach out to community. And we both happen to live, we're consultants who work across the country. We both happen to live in this little mountain town in Colorado,
Yeah.
5,500 people. And there's a lot of contentious conversation happening right now in this community around build more stuff. We need more stuff, and it's from people who have left California or the Front Range, Denver, who want now Salida, Colorado to be Denver. We want an ice
Yeah.
rink. We want this. We want that. And it's like, uh, we can't do that here. We
Yeah.
just can't afford to do that here. And there's a large parcel of property the city owns right now, and there are some plans around what they want to do with that. And we've been talking about what value is that going to add to the community. And we're charging that notion of just because there's an open space and you've had all these great ideas in your mind of dumping these things in there, what is that really going to reap in terms of
Right.
reward for everyone who lives here? And we were just discussing the value of the property as it exists today, maybe in contrast to what value it may produce for the community if we think about how we use it.
Yeah.
So simply from my perspective, by virtue of having a neighborhood park, for example, you can't suggest that there's value there unless you can actually illustrate, quantify that there's some kind of home value acceleration, but it's only going to be for the beneficiary properties, right? The ancillary
Yeah.
properties around that park. Um, and at the same time, we have to understand what is the cost associated with maintaining that little park. And what does that mean for the taxpayers in the community? What are we really subsidizing those immediate beneficiaries as opposed to a larger park that maybe a majority of the community accesses? And we were alternatively talking about these large parcels and maybe having private public partnerships where maybe you could use the public land for some productive activity or productive something that could then contribute back to the wealth, if you will, as Chuck says a lot, the wealth of the community. It can
Hmm.
contribute back to the wealth of the overall community. So it, I would say it's not a one size fits all, right? From
Yeah.
community to community, it's going to be a little bit different. We were just talking today. We've got a community that is 5,500 people. We're in a county with 20,000, and we have 650,000 acres of open space. And to suggest our little town needs another urban park for this small city to maintain is absolutely ridiculous. I think we need to have less urban parks so that we could better take care of the ones that we have and that are most critical and most accessible, not just available, but actually accessible to our
Yeah.
community members. But just because we have all these little parcels and everybody's like, well, the city should take it so it's not developed is a bit counterintuitive. And I just don't think that's very thoughtful or intelligent. So I think the value doesn't come from the land itself. It comes from the utilization and then how it allows us to reinvest, if you will, back into the community. And are there opportunities to divest or maybe better use some of the land that we have said, well, it should be a park. I don't necessarily think that makes a lot of sense
Yeah.
from a wealth perspective, and then some kind of return on investment.
And you spend a lot of time working with communities on financial sustainability and helping them to understand even how to have diversified revenue sources that provide longer term financial stability. We often lean upon like property tax and sales tax because that's taking a portion of private capacity, private wealth, and using that for the commonwealth. But you've actually been able to identify many strategies to help parks and rec departments and cities to recover some costs or to basically factor in some of the user responsibilities there. What does that look like beyond like franchising to make sure that there's a coffee shop in every ice rink? Like, what are some of your go-to strategies? And I know it will vary by the community and by population size, but do you have some suggestions that kind of we can be on the lookout because we want to have good things, but we also are very cognizant of the fact that sometimes to have those good things, you need to create sort of the precursors to that in order to make that happen.
Yeah. I would suggest there's a bit of complexity to that question
Yeah.
and the response. One of the things that we'll find with these social servants I mentioned is their default is always, if we're going to make more money, we just need to raise fees. And we suggest that that is one approach, that's one strategy, but that is not the only strategy.
Yeah.
There's I would say the common response of, well, go get sponsorships or donations or grants, but there's a cautionary tale around every one of those things. First of all, grants, the public sector are not at the top of the food chain unless they partner with a nonprofit, because obviously granting bodies see public sector organizations as benefiting from taxpayers. So why would we provide a grant there? And often the grants aren't necessarily to take care of existing infrastructure. It's to build something new. And then there's the additional liability now we've assumed. So those are, the reciprocity that comes with a sponsorship or a partnership, or, getting a grant or a donation is fine. It's got to make sense. Raising fees when it's right makes sense. We have been notoriously irresponsible in the local park and rec world when we continue to discount older adults just simply by virtue of the fact that they're older adults. Across the United States, we find many communities, the population with most discretionary income are older adults, yet we're continually giving them discounts when they can actually pay. They just don't want to.
Yeah.
And so it's flipping the script on how we have thought about where we discount, what makes sense. We've got to get away from the term affordable. Affordable for who?
Yeah.
We need to be responsible with our cost recovery expectations, charge an appropriate market rate for certain services. Nobody ever said that taxpayer dollars should be directed to recreation services for the few. We should be putting our subsidies into our parks and our trails and our open spaces. Alternatively, our recreation side of the fence needs to be a little bit more of a social enterprise. Cost reduction. A lot of the systems we work in, they're incredibly wasteful. A lot of them are really responsible, but there are some that are wasteful. Had a client organization the other day say, you know what, you were talking about cost reduction, and we paid attention, and we've got this dumpster outside of our pool that we hardly ever use, and we spend $10,000 a year to have this dumpster behind our pool. We got rid of it. Boom, we saved $10,000. Different registration point of sale systems that are available today that have generated more business for organizations. They didn't necessarily have to raise fees. They were just more efficient and more responsible on their touch points with their community. So there are a lot of different strategies that can be employed. It's not a one size fits all. It just depends on the system. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is get organizations to connect the dots between taxpayer investment and the common good and revenue generating opportunities with individualized, exclusive, specialized services. There's no reason a city of any kind should be subsidizing a master swim team or a golf course or something that's highly exclusive, rather than putting money into their public park systems and their open spaces and their trails and things that truly are of value, if you will, to the community proper.
Yeah. And I think it touches on something you shared in the ice rink article that you wrote last year. I think it was where you said, beware when people say we represent the community. And a very vivid example of this in my community was that we had a housing project that was being proposed. It was a infill development. It should go ahead. And part of it was a land swap with the city about a small parcel of land that was then going to be turned over to the Parks and Rec Department in the land exchange. And the Field Hockey Association got wind of the fact that there was going to be a new parkland. And so they showed up in mass. They had 60 speakers show up, and they all talked about how this will be the perfect spot for their new field hockey site. And they had the counselors over the barrel because they showed up in mass, and half the opponents of the new housing were just totally confused. Why are the field hockey people here? And all that they were talking about were rubberized surfaces and meeting, top-notch tier, whatever it was. And it really did kind of have that sense. Everybody wants a field hockey site. And yet it was a consequence of a very concerted sort of effort. And I applauded them, like, well done. But you've identified that can be a real stumbling block when it comes to the responsible decision making, say the Masters curling leagues not needing the subsidy and yet piping up pretty vociferously if they're denied it. What are some strategies that you've seen communities sort of open up the discussion in order to actually bring in more, but then also sort of rule this discussion or sort of guide the discussion so it doesn't get hijacked?
Yeah, that's a great and challenging question. So I will go back to my days as an administrator. I remember in Boulder, one of the things that we talked about often in all of our senior administration or senior management team meetings was the most difficult responsibility we ever had, the most challenging responsibility we ever had, and the most important responsibility we ever had was to represent those we would never hear from or see, yet we're still paying the bills. And you hear from the same folks over and over again. If you've worked in local government, the theatrics of, the forum, the political arena. I played in 2 Little League World Series as a youngster. And I was in a meeting because we were trying to shut down a field that had been inhabited by prairie dogs for risk purposes, for safety purposes. I was told, I hate kids, I hate families. All the little leaguers showed up in their uniforms and their little caps. Half of them were crying because they couldn't play. I mean, we're trying to manage and navigate that reality in local government. And my heart bleeds for a lot of our practitioners who are really trying to do good work. I think the reality is we have to understand that notion of abstraction, remind council members, commissioners, selectmen and women that, if the 50 people that come into the room representing whatever interest group it is are there, that's great. That's a want and a desire of theirs. First of all, it doesn't necessarily translate to community need. Is that where we should be putting our precious resources in this moment in time? And we have to remember that a lot of these policymakers have strategic goals around fiscal stewards of taxpayer dollars and financial responsibility. And who are they reacting and responding to? We talk a lot about doing the math, understanding what you're getting into, understanding that these community members represent particular interests. They do not represent the broader community. So I think it's just a lot of repetition causes retention. I think if we can say certain things over and over again and plant those seeds, can be sown with these policymakers, these representative community members, that's a really important part of it. It doesn't mean at the end of the day they're not going to be swayed. Could be because of ego, could be because they want to retain their seats, could be for a number of reasons. But I think if we really appeal to their sensibilities and their humanity and say, just understand what this means for everybody else who's not here, even if the chambers are full, that I think it's an approach, and I think it's a way to influence them um, when it's possible. It's not always possible. I always remind the people that I work with, you have 3 options as practitioners. You can either do what you can to change it, you can accept things as they are, or you can get out and go someplace else that aligns with your values. There's not an option D. So we appeal to the sensibilities of these policymakers and hope that they're thinking with all 3 of their brains, right? Their head, their heart, and their guts, their instincts. So.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you then about mega complexes for sport. So sports mega complexes that are often designed for tournament play. And are they the equivalent of big box retail with ample amounts of parking that then sit vacant or sort of underused much of the time? I'm going to share an article that we wrote, not to tip the scales of your question, but around like why redundancy is often better than efficiency. And can you help me to maybe understand like the relationship between sort of your neighborhood sports field. You've got the baseball diamond that does double duty as a soccer field, but is one site versus what I see so frequently across North America are these mega complexes. You'll have 18, baseball diamonds, and isn't this wonderful? Even though on a occupancy basis, it seems like it just, there are blips when it's being used at full capacity. But the question is, many of these sports teams have the ability, they have driven there, so they would have the ability to actually go to all of the different like sites, especially with Google Maps, is pretty easy. Help me understand, like, am I barking up the wrong tree, or is this something that our cities need to be more responsible of and actually plow resources back into the local ballparks and fields, not out of romanticism of, oh, isn't it nice if it's something down the street, but actually out of value recovery, the continued sort of sustainability of our places. Tell me where I'm wrong and where there's more to the story.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're wrong. I Another article that's on our website that I wrote a couple of years ago for Park and Recreation Business Magazine was Youth Sports, Equity, Economics, and Ethics.
Hmm.
And I think we've crossed significant lines in many communities across the country. Um, and, under the, I don't know what I would call it, the veil of economic development,
Yeah.
economic
Yeah.
vitality.
Yeah.
The teams come here and they infuse their money into the local economy. Well, at the end of the day, who's really getting that money? First of
Yeah.
all, most of those studies are done by the economic development councils or those who are going to actually be the beneficiaries of these developments. They're typically not by an unbiased third party. It's like when we do feasibility studies for aquatic facilities, it's usually by an architecture firm that's actually going to get the bid to build the facility. Um,
Yeah.
and and this is a hard one for me personally because I was a sport brat. I love sports. I think sports is really important. I think we've crossed lines though in terms of how much money we have invested in these things. I think it's interesting. I would love to see some study done someday, the correlation between the obesity epidemic in the United States with we're an unhealthy society. We have unhealthy kids, and yet we're enamored with the idea of building all these multi-million-dollar complexes that sit idle 6, 7, 8, 9 months out of the year
Yeah.
in the name of economic development. You look at Northern European countries, their structures around sports fields are very different. They're just big open spaces and then they're facilitated, right? You go do what you want. You want to put up soccer goals, great. We don't do that here. And I think it's been hugely problematic. It's led to a lot of symptoms that I think people just continue to go, oh, well, that's interesting. But people want these and they come screaming in council meetings and say, this is going to be really good for the community. Well, no, it's good for
Yeah.
them. There's every community is going to probably respond to the question, is there a better way to use that space? I would imagine many people would have really good ideas for what they can use that
Right.
space and it'd be
Yeah.
much more productive. But I think we've got our priorities really messed up. Our wires are crossed. I think sports has its place, certainly, but we romanticize sports in this society, and therefore we have chosen to invest a lot. And I think it's come at a pretty significant price from a public health perspective, let
Yeah.
alone an economics perspective.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I wanted to bring in a comment that Greg had shared with me, that understanding the true cost of maintenance for each proposed program slash structure slash sort of spending sort of project. How do you help communities do that? And he's talked about it in the context of like priority based budgeting, which is a whole other way of kind of bringing people earlier into that process. What are some strategies to help like not just be like, will we be able to maintain this, which sounds like just a rhetorical question to get people on your side. Instead, it's like a genuine plea, like we need to know not just how much it costs up front, what we can get the grant for, what we can, secure the plaque for, but what are the longer term obligations that we're taking on? Because it's woven into the exact same thing we've done with our roads, our streets, our pipes, and our sports complex. Or I mean, I'm in the heart of coaching right now, and so my mind goes to sports, but actually it's recreation in the much broader sense of quality of life
Yep.
services. But how do we inculcate a sense of discipline around the true cost of maintenance for programs, and maybe make that part of the decision making process up front?
Yeah. Well, been, we have not done a good job of accounting for our costs. When
Yeah.
we talk about cost recovery, And when I say quality of life services, I'm talking libraries, I'm talking about arts and culture, I'm talking about recreation, I'm talking about parks. Um, we have looked at only our direct costs. Think about a swim lesson, and a system very typically will account for the pool noodle and the instructor, but they don't think about the tank of water and the heating and the aquatic coordinator and the director of the organization. They have not accounted for indirects and attributed those to all the services in the system. We did a project for Austin, Texas a few years ago. They have 15,000 courses, classes, events, and activities. They have a director, they have deputy directors, they have an administrative staff, they have supervisors and managers and coordinators. They have 50 aquatic facilities, average age 50 years. I mean, we've got to begin to think about all of the costs, and that's what we try to do is drill deep, and we want to identify their administrative expenses, their facility and park expenses, and attribute all of their indirects to every service they offer in the system. It's like any other financial exercise. You have to draw some assumptions, but we always encourage people to just start someplace. Let's collect what you have, and let's start thinking about what these attributions might look like. That is a really important exercise because it allows them to begin data mining, right? They can start looking at year over year
Yeah.
comparisons. And I think it starts to illuminate, here's our fiscal reality and here's what we can do. And it speaks to operations. It can speak to capital if they have good enough data where we can attribute debt service and maintenance, ongoing maintenance, and maybe even their capital improvement, their CIP expenses into that very exercise. They've got to be positioned to do that. And if they're not, we always say, okay, this is where we would encourage you to go next because we want to account for all of your expenses. One of the big problems in our world, and I would suggest in many forms of local government, is council members in particular, we'll say policymakers are enamored with the idea of benchmarking. The problem in benchmarking is that you're assuming the systems you're benchmarking against know what they're doing and they've done their due diligence relative to understanding their cost recovery because a lot of systems are only again looking at their direct costs. So we take all of this information, and we've had the privilege of working a lot with a lot of systems across the country, and now we can say this is what we're seeing in terms of cost recovery performance for systems that are accounting for all of their costs. This is what we see for aquatic expenses. This is what we see for X. This is what we see for investment in public parks, 5 acre, those kinds of things. So we feel a higher level of confidence than what our kind of national associations data has put out, which is basically we're only looking at direct costs. And that feeds systems, I think, to say, okay, what can I expect in terms of operational expenses and maintenance expenses ongoing? And then we also have I'd say some data sets that help us with, how much does it cost to replace, the HVAC in an indoor aquatic facility or in an ice arena and those kinds of things. So it gives people a more clear picture of what the true cost of doing business actually is, as opposed
Yeah.
to just arbitrarily going, oh, the national average is 25% cost recovery. So we're going to be at 25%, even though we're looking at the Chicago Park District and the city of Boulder, Colorado, and Austin, Texas, and Brookline, Massachusetts, and Napa, California. We're seeing they're all supposed to be the same. That has been incredibly destructive to us. So we're trying to flip the script, and I think we're definitely creating a bit of our own little movement on this
Yeah.
end because we're talking about this and we're being pretty bold about this topic.
Yeah. Oh, that's powerful. And it really underscores for me even the squandered capacity that has emerged because of missed opportunities to do maintenance, missed opportunities to prolong the life of structures that already are in the community and just are not being well suited or well cared for. Edward Erfurt is our Director of Community Action. I want to throw it over to Edward for just a comment and any questions for Jamie, and then we'll broaden it out as well for the rest of the folks that are here. But Edward, put you on the spot. You coach communities, and some thoughts, and then any questions.
Jamie, I love what you're sharing because we make decisions all the time in cities and never look at what it takes to actually what obligations we have with that. And parks is like the first one because like you said, I've been in City Hall where you're trying to do the right thing and they bring out the kids and they bring out the old people and they play this emotional fight over all of that. In one of the communities I was in, the library system had the same situation. They had gone through, books have so much time they can stay on the shelf. They get worn out, they get moldy. It's time to get them refreshed. and a librarian went and was refreshing the books. And this led to everybody saying, oh, they're burning all the books. No, they're getting new books in. This is how the cycle. But it's so important, all of the data, because we have this. It's not like the first time we've ever done a sports facility or first time we've ever done a park, but really recognizing that so that we're not going in blind. So I greatly appreciate that and encourage anybody as you're getting these decision making, there is the emotional side of it, but there's also this rational side with the numbers that really are worth doing. And I'm not pro book burning. The books actually they were all donated to uh, the libraries have a neat thing where they go and they take older
Yeah.
books, ship them off to places that couldn't afford new books.
Yeah. No, that's great. Greg, why did you jump in? I really appreciated the comment that you offered, and then just over to Jamie as well. But and then we've got the others in the chat. Definitely feel free to jump in if you want as well. But Greg, thoughts, reactions?
I think all this type of discussion is so necessary in local government because often, as Edward said, and then as Jamie said many times during her presentation, we don't look at the true costs of a program. We look at the benefit of cutting the ribbon because everybody likes to start a new project. We rarely look at what the true cost is of operating it. And the way that we typically do budgeting in local government, we do it by these huge, big programs that have a whole bunch of programs in them. So Parks and Rec operates tons of different things. And when you just say the Parks and Rec department, that doesn't tell you all of the things that's operating. It gives you one great big number you're dealing with. And even if you separate some of those into line items, it, it's accountable, but it's not a communicative tool. And it takes a lot to be able to communicate to people what the cost of a program is. And when they want to add something, you need to find out what they want to add and then go back to the department and say, what are the true costs of operating what's being proposed today? And what are you going to do if we add this? Does this mean that either your department has to cut something back or somebody else's department has to cut something back? When you start creating competition between departments within a government system, that gets real interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Greg, just to comment on that, I think the unfortunate reality I see more often than not is nobody's cutting anything. They're just,
Yep.
it's affecting their level of service. It's, that they'll do more with less. We'll be a lean organization because community expectations just continue to increase, yet the bucket of resources isn't increasing. And so that's become a real challenge. And, we used to talk about burnout in the 80s and 90s. Well, it's well beyond that now. We've lost a lot of really good people in our field. They're falling out of public parks and recreation. We feel like we're in a crisis relative to retaining good people in this field. Our universities used to have 120 accredited park and rec programs across the country. That's now down to 70. So there's this broad stroke. There's the financial sustainability part of it from the very kind of pragmatic, practical perspective. And then we're thinking about some of the, unspoken consequences of what this means. And, I teach this financial sustainability certification program across the U.S. I was in College Station, I mentioned, with the gentleman from Virginity the last 4 days. And these folks are like, I don't know how much longer I can do this because no one wants to talk about what's the trade-off, what's the lost opportunity. We can't continue to do this with this amount of time, space, and money. We're worried what the next decade is going to look like. Are we going to have parks and recreation in our community? This happened in Napa just 3 years ago. Napa Parks and Recreation Services were told they were going away. Wow. They were going to put parks into public works, and they were moving recreation and community services and cutting the staffing and the budget by 60%. And their rec manager, who has an MBA, she's like, hell no, not on my watch. And she flipped the script there, but she had the fortitude to champion that work. Not everybody does. So it's very complicated. I'm optimistic. I hope this is a chance for us to flip the script In some cases, it's turning a Titanic in some communities that are big,
Right.
but this idea that, yeah, we're going to keep adding stuff and have mission creep has challenged this notion that we just have no limits. When do we say no to underwater basket weaving and archery ranges and mountain bike courses and all this stuff that people expect
Yeah.
when we just don't have the resources to do this? And should we? The nobility of Parks and Recreation was open spaces and parks. It wasn't, you know, card games and basket weaving and archery ranges and everything everybody wants. That was not the intention of public parks and recreation.
And especially being best in class in those things, like being, our strategy is to be best. I just did a search on ChatGPT. How many places call themselves the tournament capital of, their region or their country? And, we're going to have excelling sort of strategies. But sorry, Greg, you had a thought as well, or follow up.
Well, and the other thing too is when people come and propose a program, they underestimate its cost dramatically. Like it was communicated to me recently, someone wanted to start one to help people access public transportation in different ways. And she said, and I can do this for $50,000 a year. And the board said, well, this is wonderful. And 4 years later, it was costing them $800,000 a year. And it just, they grow in leaps and bounds if nobody's monitoring all of these different things. And every one of them creates competition for limited sources of money.
Yeah. I wonder if this is somewhere, Jamie, that Ben's question is really interesting. Can civic organizations and advocates be part of the solution for maintaining smaller facilities and parcels that benefit their neighborhoods, but might be otherwise deemed too expensive to maintain? And it comes along the line, is there a role for cost sharing? Like we often talk about cost cutting or cost shedding from maybe the municipal sort of line items. But if we can embrace that idea, what you're doing is you're sharing then the cost, and the cost is going to be borne more by some of these groups that step up. I know that I'm a part of a soccer association, and we could probably do more if we were actually given the prompt. Please make sure that you do this. Take more of an active role in those types of things. I know we have curling clubs that are really like great stewards of their buildings, and then others that just sit back and complain that the city never keeps it up. What does that look like? How do we? Maybe are there places that are doing successful sort of cost sharing or work sharing strategies to help maintain older facilities?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that's an option. The question is the commitments made by those today, will that continue 2 years
Right.
from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? Partnerships are amazing when they're done well, but partnerships require reciprocity. And oftentimes, organization will come and say, well, we want to partner with the city, but what they're asking for is the city to give them a bunch of resources, and they're not going to give anything back. That's not a partnership. The city's now a granting body. And we talk about that a lot. So partnerships are amazing and they're wonderful when they work well. There's true alignment with mission or purpose, and there's a commitment on behalf of both to contribute fairly and justly. We had a big relationship with the mountain biking community in Boulder. We built a brand new mountain bike park, and everybody was all in. International Mountain Biking Association, the Boulder Mountain Biking Association, and agreements signed. This is going to be great. They're going to help maintain it. It was one of the expectations of entertaining the idea of even investing in a mountain bike park. Fast forward a few years later, all of a sudden people are moving that were part of that mountain biking association. And now it's a different generation that's using it. And they're like, why isn't the city maintaining this? Like,
Right.
well, let's talk about that. So
Yeah.
yes, when it works, we have adopt a park programs across the country, adopt a flower bed programs across the country. You have certain citizens and residents that are absolutely invested. You just have to be careful that you don't invest so much that the expectation is they're always going to be there to contribute, because there's no guarantee. There's just no guarantee. And at the end of the day, it's still the city or the district's liability.
Yeah. And the cautionary sort of advice from Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone is that many of these sort of non-governmental organizations, your optimist clubs, your happy fellows club, your odd fellows, your strange fellows, like every kind of fellow, every kind of woman, like all of these third-party organizations that have sort of sat in the gap, we actually simultaneously of seeing some of the retreat in the public realm in terms of what it's capable of, have also seen sort of a corresponding like shrinking and reduction of many of these types of service clubs abilities. And I think we're facing the consequences of that. Jay's asked a great question. Do HOA and private communities play a role in pulling money from public parks and rec?
Can I get a clarification what's meant by pulling money from Parks and Recreation? Just to make
Yeah,
sure.
so I mean, one of the things I noticed kind of anecdotally is the fact that a lot of people will vote against funding that's needed for Parks and Rec, whether it be grants, whether it be bond issues, whatever, because of the fact they're like, well, I already have a park here in my neighborhood. Why do I need to pay for the public park? Or the big one we have here in San Antonio is swimming pools. I mean, there's a really nice community pool that they're getting ready to tear up and fill in because nobody wanted to fund the repairs for it. But at the same time, if you look around, there's like 4 or 5 different privately owned HOA pools, but those aren't open to the public. Those are only available to the HOA communities. So basically, the city pool has now gone under, and only the people who are in the HOAs have access to a pool.
Yeah, Jay, I'd say 100%. We've got actually, we're starting a brand new project in master plan in El Mirage, Arizona, which is in the Phoenix metro area. And we talked about this very issue as part of the initial kickoff meeting with their project team. That they have arguably a lot of their community would be considered marginalized, underrepresented, underserved, and they're very worried because they have these subdivisions, these housing associations that have the amenities, and yet they're not interested in the common good, right? It's we have what we want and what we need, and that's good enough. So you're asking me to contribute to the community proper, I'm not really interested. So I would 100% agree with that. And it's going to vary from community to community, but I've definitely seen that have an impact.
Reminds me of a George Monbiot. I don't want to overly, or I don't think I'm politicizing it. He's an English writer out of that writes sometimes for The Guardian and other spaces. He's got a series of lectures that he did for CBC Radio on around the idea of the common good. And one of his lines that's really resonated with me, even though it probably codes political in certain discussions, is private sufficiency, but public luxuries as a contrast to the pursuit of private luxury, which is very exclusive. So an HOA is going to trumpet the fact that like no one else gets to use this. Your fancy vehicles or your elite homes, no one else gets it. And that's as a consequence, it's always in an arms race to always be better. Your yacht is never the largest, so you're always investing more. But if we begin to pivot and really value the role that public luxuries, that is things that are shared, they can be beautiful, they can be wonderful, and we all benefit from it unless we get to the point where, the pool has too many children in it. But we have ways of managing that. We have ways of, managing peak loads if we have the resources to be able to continue to maintain them at the scale that we need them to be. One of the things that Jean has identified is that many government-funded projects lack the feedback loop that is so necessary. Where do feedback loops in terms of sort of ongoing inputs, maybe having more than sort of the lifespan of a goldfish, how do we ensure that we kind of keep these things on our radar and sort of inculcate a sense of discipline and a practice of this? I think even, when Urban 3 shows up in a place, they have a wake-up call. I would imagine it's much the same when you work with a place, you work with like a core group of leaders, they begin to really get it. We've seen this with the Community Action Lab that we were working in Norman, Oklahoma with, great folks there and continue to have relationships, but simultaneously the mayor and the city or the university president announced a $1 billion stadium project. And we're like, like, how do we ensure that? And so I know that's a little bit more than like feedback loops, but is there something that helps to inculcate a sense of discipline and rigor that has lasting sort of roots in a place?
I can only speak to our work.
Yeah.
Everything we do is rooted in education. Everything. So, we start a master plan and we have work sessions with city councils and, commissions, advisory groups that are representative of the community, intended to be representative of the community. And it's important for us to try to help them understand that this is not a static exercise. You're going to create a 10-year master plan or comp plan or whatever it is for your organization. first and foremost, trying to bring in all the other departments within the municipality is really important because they tend to do their own master plans and they don't speak to one another. That's hugely problematic in and of itself. So we try to think about it, under the umbrella of an educational program, and the plan becomes a byproduct of that. And if we can help them understand that it's not static, that while this document will be blessed by you at the end of the day, and it's a roadmap, if you will, that your work is only starting, right? The process is a process, but once the plan is adopted, now the work begins. And that means it's important for you to continue to have equitable engagement, that you reach out to your community, that you help them understand. Something that I find really interesting, Detroit, of all places, which has really flipped the script, is an effort they're making to help homeowners understand where their property taxes are spent. And they're creating kiosks in the community. And so this ongoing education and information exercise that is it's two-way. We want to share with you, and we're looking for feedback from you as well. It can't just be, we're going to tell you like a didactic exercise and we're going to lecture you, but help them understand the process in a very deep, rich way, in a robust way, so that they can then continue to shepherd and champion efforts around engagement and connection, community connection, well beyond the process. And I think sometimes that's missing from planning efforts. It's an exercise. We're going to project manage this. These are the tasks. We're going to check the boxes. Here's your plan and good luck. I think approaching it a little differently as an educational opportunity to help set up policymakers and professionals to do better. I want to believe 99% of the people that run for council and are in these roles really want to do right by their communities. They sometimes just don't know how, or they're ill-equipped, or they're in over their heads, or they're overwhelmed. And I think anything we can do to help them ensure that they are communicating with their constituents in their communities, other than just they got 3 minutes at the dais if they decide to show up to a council meeting, is just really important.
That's fascinating and powerful. And it actually prompts me, I know I need to land the plane at some point. I could keep on having the conversation for hours, but can you, to close out, I would love to hear what are some things that we as strong citizens in our communities can be doing in order to support the quality of life services that you're helping places to sort of establish and maintain and preserve. What are things that we can do to be strong citizens in this realm? And what are some of the things that you've noticed are hallmarks of people that engage well in this process and really help, even outside of elected office, to actually improve their place by being good participants in the process?
I think just stepping up to the plate, it sounds a bit cliche, being engaged, being interested, understanding, doing our best. I think this goes for all of us, regardless of whether it's quality of life services or not. Being willing to be good listeners and being open, rather than we know everything and I'm going to impose my will on you and I want, and therefore you're going to do. I think trying to understand in a compassionate way that just because you pay taxes doesn't mean you're entitled to everything you want and more. But that's incumbent upon us to help explain that.
Yeah.
So I think, I mentioned that reciprocity earlier. I think there's this reciprocity, and there's a reciprocal, I think, responsibility that citizens have to their governments as much as government has to the citizen. I mean, the governments exist the pleasure of, but without our governments, it would be very tragic. So I think it's being like a good partner to the organization that represents your interests. And I think that can go in 100 different directions depending on, what is the flavor of the day conversation in our communities and what needs to be done in this moment. And, if it's in a park, if it's in a community and it happens to be about parks, recreation, arts, culture, libraries, whatever it is, being informed, being willing to go and listen, as opposed to nobody tells me anything. I live in a mushroom factory, but you haven't picked up a paper lately, or you haven't looked at the website, you haven't been interested, and yet you play victim, and they're not doing right by you. So I think none of us can play victim in this. I think we have a responsibility as practitioners and consultants and educators and advisors and government to do our, uphold our responsibility and our obligations. And alternatively, our citizens need to step up from everything as obvious as make sure you vote, be informed, right? And participate. And I'm hopeful that we're going to see more of that as time goes on. It's interesting to just kind of see how more engaged people are right now, given civic discourse. Some of it's not, maybe as civil as we'd hope, but I just think we all have a part in this play, and the more we can all participate, the much better off we're all going to be.
I love that. We're going to close with that because that's a wonderful way to wrap up. As we head into a weekend, I hope everyone's underwater basket weaving goes well as all of your other engagements in your community. Keep doing what you can to build a strong town. Thank you so much, everyone.